Okay, so another good way to test your understanding of what we've been learning is to look at enthymemes, what I'm going to call moral enthymemes. And so an enthymeme is an argument where a statement is left implicit. It's kind of obvious, but it's not, because it is so obvious, maybe it's not made explicit. But in this class, I always want you to make things explicit. So I can imagine somebody giving me this as an argument, and I'm going to say, you need more support for your conclusion. There's an implied premise. What is it? Okay, so we're going to figure that out in a minute, but I'm just giving you a sense of how to use that kind of feedback in the future. So we know that, so all of these are implied moral arguments. I'll let you know that right now. Okay, so they're implied moral arguments. They are moral enthymemes. There's a missing premise. It is implied by the statements that are provided in the arguments. What we're going to do is we're going to use our knowledge of what we've learned so far to figure out what is the missing statement that needs to be made explicit to create or to transform these into properly constructed moral arguments. So we know that the checklist says we need at least two premises and a conclusion. We know that we need a moral statement, we need a moral premise, and a moral conclusion. So look, Chauvin is evil. That's definitely a moral statement. Okay? And it's saying that some particular person is evil, so it's probably a particular moral judgment. Up here it says, police officers who are overly aggressive are evil. Do you see how this is much more general than this? This is about anyone who's a police officer. So it's about, this is making a claim, assigning the moral value of evil to a wide or an entire class of people, that is the set of people we call police officers, whereas in the conclusion it's naming a particular police officer and saying that particular person is evil. So this is a moral statement. It's a general moral principle. So according to our diagram then, what is missing? What is missing in our argument? We've got a moral premise, a moral conclusion. We're missing a what? Non-moral premise. So we're going to write non-moral statement. Premise 2. Now we need to figure out what is the sentence that we are missing, the statement, that will not have the word evil in it, nor any other moral value for the purpose of what is implied here. Let's start with the conclusion. Remember, the conclusion, if it's a good argument, should not have anything in it that is not already in some form already in the premises. Now, you cannot have this conclusion exactly in the premise, otherwise you've just assumed your conclusion is true in the premises and your argument is invalid. But we need to say something about what? Do you see anything in the premises about Chauvin yet? No. So obviously we need to say something about Chauvin. We know that Chauvin is a what? He is a police officer, and we know that, and a lot of people claim that he was what? Overly aggressive in doing what? Using his knee on whom? George Floyd. So let's go ahead and write that then. Chauvin was overly, in fact we want to write Chauvin is a police officer who was overly aggressive. Now we could say in using his knee on George Floyd's neck, but this is fine for the purposes of this lesson. Okay, so then we have what? Chauvin is evil. Okay, so now do you see how this all links up? Here we've got police officers, so an entire class of people who are overly aggressive are what? Evil. So evil is being assigned to an entire class of people. Police officers who are overly aggressive are evil. Now we've got a specific person, right? This is about a group of people right here. So this group, all police officers who are overly aggressive, all of them are evil. But here it's talking about one police officer, Chauvin. We want to make sure that our reader knows that Chauvin is a police officer. If Chauvin is not a police officer, then maybe it was okay for him to be overly aggressive. But this claim is about police officers. So we want to make sure that we state that Chauvin is a police officer who was what? Overly aggressive. We could add the other stuff about George Floyd, but it's not necessary for the purpose of this lesson. So we needed to put in that part. And now we've got Chauvin in the premises, and we've got Chauvin connected to being a police officer and being overly aggressive, which allows us then to see that these two, right, are working together to warrant this moral conclusion. So here's evil right here. So again, we have premise one, a general moral claim, being combined together with a non-moral statement to warrant, support, advance a moral conclusion, a particular moral judgment. By itself, as you learned in the reading, the premise by itself does not do enough to get to the conclusion. It does not offer enough support because nowhere in the premises was there anything about Chauvin, whether he's a police officer, and whether he was overly aggressive. How do we know he was overly aggressive or not? You need to claim that as a fact if it is a fact. Okay, so let's go ahead and do argument 4. If you want to try this one on your own, you can. Just, pause the video and then resume. Okay, so we have an enthymeme. We need to figure out what the missing premise is. To know what the missing premise is, if this is a properly constructed moral argument, it helps to know what the other statements are. So what are the other statements in terms of our current terminology? Well, we've got morally permissible right here. And a morally permissible is being assigned to the action of killing a criminal who is resisting arrest. Okay? Here we also have morally permissible. And morally permissible is being assigned to killing a specific person. So as we can see, this is a moral statement, particular moral judgment, moral statement, general moral principle. Now, I'm not saying you have to agree. Just because this is labeled as a general moral principle and this is labeled as a general moral principle, that doesn't mean you have to accept or endorse the general moral principle. And in fact, that's an interesting question. How do we even decide which moral rules we ought to live by? How does a general moral principle come to be? Does it just come out of nowhere? Some people says it comes from God, the Bible, the Ten Commandments. What if you don't believe in that stuff? Or even if you do believe in that stuff, don't Christians and different religious sects and different Christian groups go to war and claim each other that the other person's doing something wrong or right? No, okay, I'm just brainstorming. But the idea here is that you do not have to agree that this is really a general moral rule that anyone ought to live by. And starting week 6, we're going to start to see how you can try to argue for a general moral principle. That's not the point right now. The point is to recognize when a statement is functioning or being used as a general moral principle, and that's it. Okay, so premise 2. So what do we know is missing then? We have a moral premise, a moral conclusion, a general moral principle, a particular moral judgment. So what is missing? Again, a non-moral statement. Okay, so we need to look for clues. So we already have something about moral permissibility in our conclusion, and we see that it is here in our premise. But we don't have any information in our premises about what? George Floyd, and that he was what? Killed. So that's what we're missing. We need to say George Floyd, not that he was killed, because what is this saying is permissible? It's not saying it is morally permissible to kill, right? It's saying it's generally permissible to kill. I mean, that would be a moral principle, that it's not wrong to kill. Like The Purge. Think of the movie The Purge. It was not wrong to kill. And in fact, in The Purge, at least the first two, it was almost like you had a duty, an obligation as a true patriot, right, to kill. Interesting. So it is morally permissible to kill. This is still a general moral principle because it is still assigning a moral value generally to a category of actions. That is killing anyone who's a criminal who is resisting arrest. So George Floyd is a person who was what? George Floyd has resisted arrest. So now you can see we have a proper link up between the premises and the conclusion. Here we have something about criminals as resisting arrest, and then here we make the non-moral claim that this particular individual was in fact resisting arrest. No moral values assigned. We just are establishing as a fact that someone did something, then applying principle 1, a general moral principle, to principle 2, to premise 2, a non-moral statement, it is thought to be warranted that another moral statement follows a particular moral judgment. So again, this argument could not get off the ground because a non-moral premise was missing. You cannot infer a particular moral judgment from only a general moral principle. You also need a non-moral statement that was discussed and exemplified in the reading as well. Okay, so now here's a lesson that I want to throw in there. Most often when people are having debates in society, it's usually about this. A lot of the times it's about the facts. It's about the non-moral elements of the debate. So if you're going to say that the police officer was overly aggressive, you want to establish the non-moral fact of, was George Floyd resisting arrest? Yes or no? If he was resisting arrest, did he do so to such an extreme that Chauvin had to be so aggressive? So then the debate becomes, oh, well, let's all watch the video. Then you need forensic scientists. So if that's your thing, criminal justice, and you want to be a forensic scientist, that's what you guys are trying to do. Forensic scientists are trying to establish non-moral elements of a decision that needs to be made about someone who is thought to have broken the law, and usually our laws are tied into morality of right and wrong. Usually, not always. Okay. So I'm just letting you know that most of the time, in most debates about anything, including the killing of George Floyd, the protest, the looting, the rioting, a lot of the time, the debate is about the non-moral elements of a debate and not the moral elements. Okay, so let's go to our last example. Argument 5. Police officers have been known to kill human beings. All right, so this is another enthymeme. There's a missing premise, an implied premise. It's an implied moral argument. Oh, I forgot with this previous argument, this was a properly constructed moral argument, so let's write that sentence. This is a properly constructed moral argument. Okay. Now, I'm not going to give you enthymemes, but you might come across them, and maybe you wrote one in your foundational writing assignment. So this one, we could say, this was not, we could say this was first a moral enthymeme. Enthymeme means an argument with a missing premise. Or you could say this was first an implied moral argument. You can say that instead. So you can say this was first a moral enthymeme. Enthymeme meaning an argument with a missing premise or conclusion. Or you could say this was first an argument, that an implied moral argument. Or this was originally an argument trying to be a moral argument, but it was not morally constructed. So look at all the different ways you can say that. I want you to say it one of those other ways, not the way that I'm writing it here. But for your notes, yes, write it like that. I just don't want you to copy me for later work. This was first a moral enthymeme, but we supplied the missing premise. Premise. A non-moral statement. This turned it in to a properly constructed moral argument. So you can use this as a template, but of course, I'd like for you to use your own words, but you know what the terminology is: moral enthymeme, or not a properly constructed moral argument, implied moral argument. And you'd want to say something about having to add something to it, to supply something, to articulate something that was missing and what that missing thing was, and then what the point of that was, well, to get it to be a properly constructed moral argument. Okay, very last argument for task 1 of week 5. Again, this is a moral enthymeme. Police officers have been known to kill human beings. That's a non-moral statement. It just says that there's a certain group of people, a class of people, who have done certain things to people generally. But there's nothing about rightness or wrongness in it. Down here, we have, it is always wrong for police officers to kill human beings. Again, you don't have to agree with any of this. This is why you need intellectual empathy, right? You need intellectual empathy, because if you're constantly fighting and saying, that's not true, that might get in the way of your understanding the point of the lesson, right? So be careful not to do that. Just because you don't agree with this being a general moral principle doesn't mean that it's not functioning as a general moral principle. So make sure you're putting your biases on hold, practicing intellectual empathy to understand the lesson, to understand how the words and concepts are being used, to understand how a statement that you might vehemently disagree with can nevertheless said to be functioning as a general moral principle, even if you think it is a false general moral principle. Okay, so here we have, it is always wrong for police officers to kill human beings. Okay, there's the action. Now this is interesting. So this says police officers have been known to kill human beings. So what's missing? So this is a moral statement. It looks like a general moral principle. So all by itself, it could be a general moral principle. But that's why this last example is so important, and it goes back to something I said earlier. You always have to look at words and statements in their bigger context. So this is a conclusion. I've already told you that this is a moral enthymeme. It's just missing something to be a properly constructed moral argument. Since we know that properly constructed moral arguments will have conclusions as particular moral judgments, and because you know that this is what this is, it's just missing a premise, we know that this is a particular moral judgment in this context. Now, that said, what are we missing in the premises that are not in that's not in the conclusion? We can also go back to our checklist. We're missing a what? We have the premise that's a non-moral statement. It happens to be first in argument 5. We have a conclusion that's a moral statement. Happens to be last in argument 5. We're missing what? A premise that is a moral statement. Okay, so again, so here we're having the moral statement that should be a premise come second in the argument, which is fine. So we need to say something about wrongness in premise 2, the missing premise, right? So it is always wrong for police officers to kill human beings. Okay, police officers have been known to kill human beings. So we want to say that something is wrong, and we need it to be more general than this. I think this is the hardest one to do. I think it's harder to figure out what is the missing general moral principle than it is to figure out what is the missing non-moral statement. So we need something that is more general than saying it is wrong for police officers to kill human beings. What we might want to say is that it's just plain wrong to do what? Because here it's talking about a group of people and how they've done what? They've killed human beings. And here we want to say something about, and here we draw a conclusion that it's wrong for police officers to kill human beings. So what could we say generally about killing them? We could say it is always, yeah, this one's much harder, wrong to kill. But don't worry, you don't have any tests where you have to be quizzed on this. I just want you to apply this later in specific instances. So it is always wrong to kill. Okay, so now we have the moral value of wrongness, right, being assigned to any instance or action that entails killing. Now can you see how the logic links up to the conclusion? We've got a non-moral statement working together with a general moral principle to derive a particular moral judgment. Again, here the problem was originally that we could not get the moral argument off the ground. We had a non-moral statement, and you cannot go from a non-moral statement to a moral claim in a valid way. I mean, you can. It's causally possible. I just did it originally from premise 1 to the conclusion. But in terms of constructing a properly moral argument, a valid argument, a good moral argument, we need to supply a moral premise. We can't just claim from a non-moral state of affairs that a particular moral judgment must be true. This needs help to getting to, What we need is this is just a fact, right? We need to have a general moral principle. So here, even though the order is different, we're still applying what's here to what? That. So premise 2 is a general moral principle that is being applied to premise 1, a non-moral state of affairs. So I hope you didn't think in your mind that the direction is always this way. It's not always the case that premise 1 is a general moral principle being applied to something that's always going to be premise 2. It could be that premise 2 is the general moral principle, and it's being applied to another premise, in this case premise 1, the non-moral statement, to derive the particular moral judgment. All right, that's all I have for you. This concludes our lessons on moral statements and moral arguments.